Good afternoon, everybody. Again, thanks for coming. I'll introduce myself first. My name's Pete Simpson. I'm a member of the microplastics restriction team here. There are a number of us in this team. It's quite a large team, and you'll get to meet a number of them today. Mark, I should say, is our process coordinator for restrictions. I'm not sure he introduced himself, but he's responsible for all of the REACH restriction activities that go on here at ECHA. Okay, so got a problem with the clicker. Okay, all right. So before we really got into the technicalities of the microplastics restriction, we felt it would be useful to reiterate, or at least go into some further detail on the REACH restriction instrument in general, just so that you're fully acquainted with how REACH restriction works, why it's needed, and the types of REACH restrictions that have been proposed in the past. Essentially, the idea here is to make sure that any misunderstandings in terms of what a REACH restriction is all about can be cleared up very early in the workshop. So there's three things that I want to cover, essentially. The first is, under what circumstances is a REACH restriction considered to be needed in the first place? The second is, what is a REACH restriction? What's it comprised of? Are they all the same? Are they all different, for example? And then finally, very briefly, I'll give an overview of the timeline involved of preparing a REACH restriction and the sort of process steps. So which actors are involved in at which points, and how long overall will this process take? So the first question really is, under what circumstances is a restriction needed, according to the legislation? So essentially, the idea is that a restriction is a safety net. So it's a safety net for addressing an unacceptable union-wide risk to human health or the environment from chemicals that cannot or have not been addressed by means of other REACH processes, like the registration, evaluation or authorisation, titles of REACH, or some other community action. So it's there as a backstop. It's instigated by means of something called an Annex 15 report. And you might have heard us already talking about this, but this is what, as ECHA, will be preparing as dossier submitter, in this case, over the next 12 months, and submitting it in January next year. An Annex 15 report can be prepared either by a member state, or it can be prepared by ECHA at the request of the Commission, and this is what happened here. When a member state prepares an Annex 15 report, they typically have slightly longer in order to prepare their report, because they're not constrained by a legal deadline, whereas as ECHA we have 12 months to prepare our Annex 15 report, as this runs from the date which we entered our intention to develop this report in our Registry of Intentions, which was in January this year. There's lots of information on the ECHA website about restrictions, about the restriction process, about the types of substances that have been restricted. All of the available guidances, for example, that we'll be using are all available on the website. So if you haven't had a look, take the opportunity to, at some point, have a look at all of the information on the website. So now that we know why a REACH restriction could be needed, what is a REACH restriction? Let's go into some detail on that. So it's a union-wide action. So it's across the European Union and then European Economic Area where REACH applies. And the same requirements apply to the whole of the EA from the entry into force. A REACH restriction can apply to any substance on its own, it can apply to a substance in a mixture, or it can apply to a substance in an article. Because it's a safety net, because it's this backstop, there are very few limitations to its scope. So, for example, the tonnage thresholds that are underpin the registration requirements, for example, don't apply to a restriction. And equally, a a restriction can apply to polymers. They are substances, even though polymers are exempt from registration. So normally a restriction can be used to limit or ban the manufacture, placing on the market, or use of a substance. And because it's placing on the market, it covers imports to the European Economic Area, as well as anything that's produced within the EU. So on the basis of this, it may seem as though it's a rather blunt measure. It could be considered that it's a sledgehammer to potentially crack a nut. But this isn't really how we see it, and it's not really how it's been applied in the past, and that's what I want to try and get over to you now. So a restriction really can comprise any relevant condition to address the identified risk. So, for example, a restriction can focus on certain uses of a substance where it's these uses which are associated with the risk. A restriction can impose minimum technical measures, like personal protective equipment, for example, in order to limit a risk. A restriction can even impose such things as labelling requirements in order to control the risk. So it's not just a ban, and I think this is really important that we understand this over the next day and a half. So, of course, what we refer to as the scope of a restriction can be targeted to address the use of the substances that pose the greatest risks, and also it can be targeted where the measure is most proportionate. So a restriction doesn't have to apply if it's a disproportionate measure. What we like to say, and we want to really emphasise this, and even in the World Cafe later on, is that as far as we're concerned, there's a separation when we do a restriction between the substance that the restriction applies to and then the scope of that restriction. So just because we're restricting a substance doesn't mean all uses will be restricted, for example. The scope of the restriction is what applies. And that's really important when we talk about the definition of a microplastic. Because whatever definition we settle on eventually in terms of a microplastic doesn't mean that that will lead to a restriction across all uses. The substance as such can be defined, and then the scope of the restriction will follow later. It's important that we know that uses can be derogated. This means that they're not subject to a restriction where there's a robust justification for this, and they can continue to be, the substances continue to be used where they're derogated. Although these can be time limited, and particularly where the derogation is there to allow a transition to an alternative substance or technology, where there's a good timeline known for this. REACH restrictions will quite often include things like concentration limits, and these are selected quite carefully in order to prevent an intentional use of the substance, but not so low as to confound enforcement where you would measure it everywhere, for example, because of just background contamination. So this is another way that we have a refined approach in restrictions. Restrictions will always, I would say, have a transitional period once a restriction enters into force, so when it's published in the official journal. And that will allow the supply chain to adapt. So it's a period where the restriction conditions don't apply, but the restriction has entered force, i.e. it's a legal mechanism. Now, the length of that transitional period can be justified on a case-by-case basis, depending on the use that's being restricted and the status of the supply chain. There can even be variable transitional periods within a particular restriction, depending on the types of uses that would be covered. So that's the theory, but I just wanted to stress a few examples to exemplify some of these principles. The first one is entry number 56 on Annex 17, if you ever feel as though you want to really check the annex on this. It's for a substance called methylene diphenyl diisocyanate, and it's more commonly referred to as this expanding foam that maybe you've used at home to fill a big hole that you didn't know how to fill in any other way. There's a restriction on the use of this substance as a constituent in mixtures for supply to the general public. Now, this is a blanket restriction, but there are a number of derogations to allow continued use. So the derogations in this particular case correspond to ensuring that the packaging contains protective gloves. So if you've ever bought any of this foam and you wonder why there's a pair of gloves in the cap, it's because the restriction means that it can't be placed on the market unless those gloves are provided. It's also important that various warnings are included on the product label. So warnings for those that could have prior sensitization to diisocyanates, warnings for those with specific pre-existing health conditions like eczema or asthma that could be particularly sensitive to these substances. And then there's also instructions on appropriate use conditions, so minimum ventilation requirements, for example. This is all conditions imposed by the restriction to allow this substance to continue to be placed on the market. A second example, slightly different, is for dichloromethane, entry number 59 on Annex 17, and it's a restriction on placing on the market as a constituent in mixtures for the general public or professionals. So there's no use of this allowed by professionals or the general public unless, and again there's a series of derogations associated with that restriction, the member state involved opts to allow to derogate use as a paint stripper by specifically trained professionals. And then again, the restriction details the sort of certification scheme that needs to be set up in that member state to allow those professionals to continue using this substance as a paint stripper. And in addition to this, there's also minimum standards for industrial installations that do industrial paint stripping. And they set minimum operational conditions and risk management measures, for example, for things like ventilation requirements, operational conditions to minimise evaporation, the uses of specific personal protective equipment when handling this substance. So this substance is still on the market, but it's on the market with certain caveats. The third example, this is slightly different because this is not yet a legal restriction. It's just a restriction which has been proposed by ECHA, has been through the evaluation by ECHA's scientific committees, and now it's waiting for decision making. But it's an interesting one because it's quite generic. It's about the use of lead-based stabilisers in PVC. All of those substances aren't identified in the restriction, but it's a restriction of all lead-based stabilisers. And it's a restriction on the use of these substances to stabilise the PVC and the placing on the market of any PVC articles that have been stabilised with these substances, which is imports. So this prevents any PVC imported from outside of the EU being stabilised with lead-based stabilisers. And it uses a concentration limit of 0.1% lead weight per weight in order to set that limit there. Now, what the restriction also does is that it recognises that continued presence of lead in PVC can sometimes be beneficial, and this is within the context of recycling. So there's a derogation built into this restriction that was justified based on socio-economic and risk, because there were greater emissions if the derogation wasn't included, that certain article types can continue to be produced using recycled PVC, and those articles would have a lead concentration greater than this 0.1% because of the legacy use of various lead substances in PVC in the past. However, the derogation also sets out that there are specific conditions of that reuse to ensure that the risk is controlled, and essentially in terms of rigid applications, this is this requirement for encapsulation. So you can have a multi-layered pipe, for example, with PVC that meets the concentration limit on either side, and then sandwiched in the middle, there's a layer with a higher concentration of lead. And if this pointer will work, this is what you can see in this green layer here in this PVC pipe. And then also in terms of PVC profiles, which is what your doors or your windows could be made with in your home or in your office, there's a co-extrusion process which allows the internal parts of the window to be produced using recycled material, whilst the outside portions are made of the compliant material. So it's allowing these substances to be on the market still, but in a more controlled way to ensure that the risks associated with them are controlled. Okay, so finally I'm going to talk about the timeline and the process. This is taken from the website. It's a bit complicated. I'm not going to go through every step, you'll be pleased to hear, but I just want to highlight 3 of them. The first phase here is the dossier preparation phase, and time goes from left to right in this figure. This is where we are now. ECHA are the dossier submitter for the microplastics restriction. So the activities that go on during this phase are our call for evidence, it's our risk assessment, it's our analysis of alternatives and our socio-economic analysis, and then we will complete our dossier and we'll submit it in January 2019. Then there's a second phase, which we can call the ECHA committees phase, the opinion-making phase, and that's essentially a peer review of our analysis by ECHA's independent scientific committees for risk assessment and the Scientific Committee for Socio-Economic Analysis. Running alongside their evaluation of the dossier is a public consultation. The first one lasts 6 months. Then there's a second public consultation on the draft SAIC opinion for a further 60 days later in the process. Overall, this opinion-making phase takes a further 12 months. And once that's concluded, those opinions are collated and then sent to the Commission for what we call the decision-making phase. And this is ultimately when any restriction would enter into force. And then pending on transitional arrangements, for example, there would then be a period before compliance and enforcement would take place. And just to show you, this is basically where we are here at the moment. So we're nearly halfway through the dossier preparation phase, which is why we're in quite a hurry to get the information. So just conclusions here. So the REACH restriction is a safety net with very few limitations to its applicability. However, we don't consider that it's a blunt instrument. It can be a very targeted and proportionate measure. And because of this, the range of measures ensure a proportionate targeted risk management. But and I should stress this, Mark's already stressed it, you'll hear it lots of times during the next day and a half. This proportionate targeting can only happen on the basis of the availability of good quality information that we can use to justify proportionate targeting. The process is highly transparent and it can be influenced by the public consultation. This is mainly within the opinion-making phase that you can follow what's happening. Oh, sorry. And that's that. Thanks.